What a weird season for the Memphis Grizzlies. This is a team that went into the year with high expectations, for the most part reached them, getting the number 2 seed in the playoffs, and people thought they were going to go far, and they didn't. They won 2 games in the playoffs, and for a team that's as talented as they are, that means there's going to be question marks despite injuries they had in the playoffs, despite some weird circumstances around the team. This roster is going to look different. Really quickly though, I wanted to thank Sorare and the MBPA for sponsoring today's video. Sorare is a sports fantasy game and marketplace featuring officially licensed digital player cards from the NBA. And now that includes the playoffs as well. In addition to the normal gameplay that happens every single week, Sorare is also hosting a playoff-long postseason tournament where you accumulate points throughout the entirety of the postseason. And as we get further and further along in the postseason, those lineup choices on Sorare are going to get that much more difficult. You can see mine here, and at this point, because of the points cap you have to stay under on Sorare, I really went with like a stars and scrubs kind of thing with AD and Booker and a couple other guys that are probably gonna have decent games, but really my lineup is gonna be anchored by those stars because it's the postseason. That's how the games work. Just make sure that you go on Sorare, you set your lineup every single week to make sure you're accumulating points on that playoff leaderboard. So make sure you click the link in the description to join the postseason long tournament on Sorare NBA today. Terms apply and game rules can be found on Sorare.com. Make sure you guys are setting your lineup for that postseason long tournament over on Sorare. And thank you again to Sorare and the MBPA for sponsoring today's video. All right, so let's get into the details here a little bit. First and foremost for Memphis, their biggest free agent, really their only big free agent, is Dillon Brooks. And that's just a weird situation in itself because when you listen to what the front office, the ownership is saying about the team in their exit interviews and after the year, there's not a long-term commitment to Dillon Brooks. Like they're talking about how excited they are about obviously Ja, Jaren Jackson Jr., even Desmond Bane. They're not coming out and saying Dillon Brooks is our guy. And a lot of the things that they're saying about their team that they need to improve could be improved by getting rid of Dillon Brooks. First and foremost being the maturity. Second being able to space the floor a little bit better, having a little bit more lineup versatility. All those things would potentially be helped on this roster by no longer having Dillon Brooks on it. And so I don't think it's a guarantee by any means that Brooks returns to Memphis, and his free agency is something we can talk about in a different video if we'd like to. Overall, I think it became clear by the end of that Lakers series that they were better with someone like Luke Kennard on the floor, which if you're at that point of your career, it's probably a good idea for everybody to just kind of move on. And I'm going to try and keep this to basketball specific stuff here for Memphis, because obviously off the court, there's some things that need to be addressed in terms of maturity, in terms of taking things seriously. And I think they'll do a good job of addressing that. But on the floor, this is definitely a flawed roster. Like they have their core, they have their 3 guys. They have Ja, they have Triple J, they have Desmond Bane, they have some other relatively interesting guys. The thing about this for Memphis now is this isn't like, oh, we're kind of a fun up and coming group team and everybody's just excited about us. Like that's not where they are anymore. Like they're very clearly in a, we need to be pushing for a title kind of area here. Now that Ja is on his next contract, Jaren Jackson, same thing. Desmond Bane's going to get a new extension. Like this is going to start to be a very expensive roster. And the question could be asked that maybe they missed their window in terms of maybe going a little bit more all in on this season, given how wide open the West was. I know they tried at the deadline. They tried to bring in guys like OG. They tried to bring in someone like Mikal Bridges. They put out some very competitive offers. But if you're looking at this roster moving forward, I think it's clear that as currently constructed, despite how great Jaren Jackson is, despite Ja, despite Desmond Bane, they're a little bit lower on the totem pole than some of the other top tier teams in the West. They're certainly still contenders, but maybe closer to semi-contenders than they are true contenders. So how do you fix that? How do you change this roster? Well, again, I would mention that the core remains intact, and without injuries in this postseason, I think we could be having a very different conversation about Memphis. However, there's also some things that people kind of misunderstand about this team. I think there's a mindset that they are this team that plays incredibly hard and is great on the offensive glass and is great in transition. Well, they're pretty good transition team. They do have a lot of good energy, and I like Taylor Jenkins as the coach. But the offensive rebounding stuff, as we saw in the postseason, is basically just Steven Adams. Like if Steven Adams plays, that really adds to what they do well, which is great energy, get up and down the floor, and they get extra possessions through offensive rebounds. They don't turn the ball over a ton. Like that's what they do. And without Steven Adams, obviously that was an issue. Granted, him and Brandon Clark both getting hurt within a couple weeks span was absolutely brutal, and I think probably one of the main reasons that they struggled as much against the Lakers as they did. But continuing to shore up that front court certainly is going to be critical without Brandon Clark this upcoming season. But also, I would encourage them to explore a relatively all-in solution to this roster. Maybe not giving up every single asset possible, but if there's an offseason to look at Zaire Williams, some other stuff, and a couple of picks for this wing that really helps us, I think this is the offseason to do it. Like, it's cool to think that you're a relatively interesting team and just continue to run it back and look to continue to grow and develop. But at a certain point, when you look around at the rest of the Western Conference and there are teams making all-in moves like this, if you're serious about winning a title, I think this offseason is probably the time to try and make that happen if you're Memphis. The other thing that helps them with that is, unlike a lot of the other teams in the West, they have all of their future first-round picks, as well as Golden State's first next year, which is very lightly protected. I think it's top 4, top 5. Like, they're going to get that pick next year, which allows them to really take a look at a lot of different options. I think a team like Milwaukee could be looking to make some changes, and maybe you could get Chris Middleton in a sign and trade, a couple of other, star options around the league. The free agency class in itself isn't fantastic, and so I think it would have to be either a trade or a sign and trade. But the first thing that this roster absolutely needs, as do most rosters around the league, is they need a wing. They need a wing that can guard and can shoot and can at least be somewhat of an offensive threat. And that's something that Memphis struggles with, something that a team like Cleveland struggles with. That's something that even a team like Milwaukee at times struggles with. And so it's going to be expensive to try and get one of those guys, as they saw trying to get OG at the deadline, as they saw trying to get Mikal Bridges at the deadline. And it's going to require, Zaire Williams and multiple picks probably to bring that guy in. But I think that's the missing piece for this roster. The other missing piece would be floor spacing. I think that as great as a lot of the players on their team are, I love Triple J, I love Ja, I love Desmond Bane. They need more spacing from guys other than Triple J and Desmond Bane. I think when you're relying on Luke Kennard as much as they were this postseason, I think that point is made pretty clear that if you're that desperate for spacing, you need to address that in the offseason. Maybe a little bit more versatility in terms of what you can do in your front court with some of those spacing issues, as well as having that extra wing, that starting caliber wing, would be helpful as well in terms of that guy maybe playing up a position. There are some options out there for you, maybe not as much from a spacing standpoint, but someone like Jeremy Grant I think would be an interesting option for Memphis, is like kind of playing the middle on this, where maybe it would cost a pick or two, but it wouldn't cost all these 4 future first round picks and a pick swap. I think that's probably the land of offseason moves Memphis is going to find themselves. But one thing that I do want to make sure that I hit on in this video is there's going to be a lot of negative Memphis stuff this offseason because of just the way their year went during the season with the Ja stuff and being the 2 seed and winning that exact same amount of postseason games, just 2. But overall, this has been one of the better organizations in the league over the last couple of seasons, and continually have ranked very, very high in any of my future rankings, either an A or an A plus, pretty much for their future over the last couple of seasons. And just because Steven Adams got hurt, Brandon Clark got hurt, Ja got hurt even during the series, and you played a Lakers team that was one of the best teams in the league post-trade deadline, I wouldn't overreact to this too much. Like, I definitely think that moves are needed. I definitely think they need to raise their ceiling. I think that wing spot is something they desperately need to address, and I think it's time to move on from Dillon Brooks. But overall, just as fans of the league, evaluating this team, I wouldn't be too negative. Sometimes stuff happens, ask Milwaukee. Sometimes stuff happens with injuries and a variety of circumstances, and it's just not your year. And it feels like a waste, and it doesn't feel very good when you put in all this time and you win 50-something games just to win 2 playoff games. But overall, the core of the roster is very solid. The leap that we saw from Jaren Jackson Jr. this year is critical to their future. If he can just find a way to stay on the floor more, play more minutes, not foul as much, be a little bit healthier, that's going to be huge for them. And there are a lot of teams around the league that would really like to be where Memphis is right now, from a roster construction standpoint, in terms of their youth, all that different stuff. And I think that even as weird as their year got, don't overreact too much. If they were healthy, that series probably goes 7. Maybe they even beat the Lakers, and that would have been a pretty big accomplishment given how well the Lakers have played post-trade deadline. And I wouldn't be so scared that I would just tear everything down and try and trade away, everything on the roster outside of the big 3. But I would look to make some kind of moves. I don't think you can just run it back with Dillon Brooks again and have the exact same roster. Need a little bit more flexibility, need a little bit more versatility, certainly need more spacing, a little bit more offensive firepower, and guys that you actually have to respect and guard on the wing. All those things added together, I think, will really, really help Memphis. They've got a couple of guys that they drafted last year that I'm sure they're going to put a lot of time into developing. They're going to be fine. They're still good. They're annoying at this point because it's just the personality of their team. But overall, from a roster construction standpoint, they're still a team with one of the brighter futures in the Western Conference. And with some adjustments, I could easily see them being a conference finals team next year.